Yeah, so I am a New Testament professor. That means I teach a lot of undergraduate students how to read the New Testament, where it came from, who the heck Jesus and Paul are. Some of my students have never opened the New Testament before, so it's always an exciting adventure. I also do a lot of research and writing on things that I'm interested in, questions that I think are really important that haven't been addressed very well. And one of those questions is women and sex and the church, and how do we read scripture with those parameters in mind?
Wow. Okay, that sounds super amazing and interesting. So, Carin, this is what I do on the show to get us kicked off. Okay, so I have your book right here in my hands, and it says The Samaritan Woman's Story, Reconsidering John 4 after #Churchtoo, and then it has a picture of, I would say it's the Samaritan woman. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the book, but first, I want to offer my emoji reaction to the book, and for that, I'll let you on my virtual background just so you can see my emojis. So I have 5 emojis, and then I'm just going to ask the gods of Emojitron, what is the emoji reaction we should have for this book? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm excited to see.
Okay, so we're going to the emoji tombola. Reveal the emoji. And it's a holy emoji reaction. Holy emoji reaction to the book. So, Carin, first of all, how do you feel about getting a holy emoji reaction to this book?
I feel good about this. I feel like I could reward myself with some chocolate later.
Okay, this is like the equivalent of getting an Oscar for an
excellent.
actor, okay? Okay, well, so glad you're on the show. Let's start with a simple question, just to kick us off. See how we feel about this. Is Jesus racist?
Oh, a simple question, did you say? Oh, golly. I think in this story, we certainly see some tensions, right, between in John 4, the story of Jesus in the Samaritan village talking to the Samaritan woman. It is a story that is surrounded by the question of the racial tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews. And I certainly think that the story has been read in a way that can make Jesus seem very racist, bringing his Jewish superiority into the Samaritan village and forcing this woman to recognize his superiority. He says salvation comes from the Jews after all. But in the end of the story, the message turns out to be one of reconciliation, of Jesus saying, actually, it's not the Jews who are the people of God. It's also not the Samaritans. There's a new way to be the people of God that welcomes both Jews and Samaritans. Is Jesus a racist? He certainly, in some stories in the New Testament, reflects some of the racial tensions of his day. Yeah, but also the message of the gospel is one of reconciliation and justice for all people. So
we'll leave it at maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. We're almost like starting with blasphemous right there.
Right.
So, okay. So I have like 3 main ideas for this episode. So one of them would be, can you walk us through the Samaritan woman's story? Then from there, we'll move on to a little bit of the MeToo movement, what it means, what it still is, what it's not maybe, and then to the Churchtoo movement. So first of all, can you walk us through a little bit of the Samaritan woman's story as we read it in John chapter 4?
Yeah, for sure. So here's how I read the Samaritan woman's story. We've got Jesus going home to Galilee after being in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, which was the great festival celebrating God saving the people of God from enslavement in Egypt. On the way, he passes through Samaria, which was something that not all Jews would choose to do. So many Jews chose to go around Samaria rather than through Samaria, just to avoid any potential dangerous interactions or awkward interactions with the Samaritans. But Jesus goes through Samaria. He sits down by a well that happens to be a really important place, right? So this well is the well of Jacob that Jacob dug when he and his sons lived in this land. That has resonance for the Jewish story of the Old Testament, because this is sort of the first little piece of the promised land that God's people owned and lived on. But now the Samaritans live there, and the Samaritans also claim to be descendants of Jacob and also claim to be the true people of God. So you can see in the setting of the story, there's some tensions being introduced. We're being reminded that Jews and Samaritans don't get along, as the story tells us. In this space, Jesus meets a woman who's come out to draw water for her household use. He starts talking to her, and right away, we get those racial tensions introduced. The Samaritan woman says, "Why are you even talking to me? You're Jew and I'm a Samaritan. We don't hang out together. We don't do things together." So we're reminded of those identity issues, those identity questions. Through their course of their conversation, Jesus slowly reveals himself to the woman. She slowly comes to a recognition of who he is. It's important to note that this is the longest conversation Jesus has with anyone in John's gospel. Usually he starts talking to someone and then it turns into a long sermon from Jesus. But in this story, the Samaritan woman is really an active participant and contributes a lot. She moves the conversation on. At the end of the story, she has realized that Jesus is a prophet who can answer the burning question of the day of this divide between the Jews and the Samaritans. She receives a revelation of Jesus' own identity. He tells her, "I am." And of course, later in John's gospel, that "I am," before Abraham was, "I am," is the revelation that Jesus is God. And the Samaritan woman is the first person to hear Jesus say, "I am," in the gospel. So that's pretty important. And then she runs back to her village where all of her neighbors listen to her, respect her, and believe in Jesus because of her testimony. So she is, in John's gospel, an ideal disciple, someone who comes to recognize who Jesus is and then shares it with others, witnesses to him, to his identity to others. So a model for all of us to follow, I think.
Wow. So where is the sex in the story?
Yeah, because that's all that we ever hear in the church, right? If you go all the way back to the earliest interpretation recorded that we have of this story, Tertullian in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, he's already referring to the Samaritan woman as an adulterer and a prostitute. And that just echoes through the centuries. When this story is taught in the church, it almost always focuses in on sex. In the story, it comes from the fact that Jesus reveals the woman's marital history to her. And that, I would argue, that is part of the woman coming to understand who Jesus is. So because he knows something about her, she can recognize that he's a prophet and possibly also the Messiah. But her marital history is unusual. She's had 5 husbands. She's now got a man to whom she is not married, but with whom she's living in a marital-like relationship. And that seems a bit scandalous, we might say. And that is why the way that the story is told in the church has almost always focused in on the woman as a sexual sinner.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is it? Was she regarded as a sexual sinner because of the revelation Jesus makes? Almost like it almost sounds like, are you a magician? Or how do you think Jesus knew her background? Is it because he is God, or is it because, maybe he knew her story prior to this? Or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, we don't have a sense that he would have known her story beforehand. He doesn't seem to have been a place he'd been before. He was a newcomer. And her story is so unusual. It is very, very rare to find anyone with so many marriages in the ancient world. So it's not something you could have just randomly guessed about someone either. But this is a pattern in John's gospel, that Jesus will know something about someone that he could not possibly have known as part of the process of these people coming to recognize that Jesus is something special. So I think the woman's response when Jesus says, "Oh, you have had 5 husbands and now the man you have is not your husband," her response is immediately, "Oh, you're a prophet." And I think she's picking up on what we're supposed to understand about Jesus' special insight into people's lives, that he has, he's operating under different guidelines than the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's the interaction. So from your vantage point, it seems like there is not necessarily a sexual scene, even though would you say there is some sort of like morality issue going on that Jesus addresses, or would you say that's not even the case?
I think it's not even the case. So I think that when we bring in questions of morality here, we're really reflecting a more modern understanding of marriage, and maybe not understanding entirely what this woman's situation might have been in the first century. So if you go back to the first century, people did not get married in order to have a relationship with their best friend. People did not get married to create a family and have a loving, supportive marriage with someone. They got married for really practical purposes. So it was an economic and financial transaction between 2 households. Women in particular had real importance as ways to connect a family with economic resources, political resources, social status. So the Samaritan woman probably got married the first time between the ages of maybe 12 and 15. She would have married someone who was maybe 10 years older than her, possibly even older than that. So there's a big age gap between men and women at their first marriages. Her marriage would have been arranged by her family, by her father. And her husband's marriage was also arranged by his household, right? So it's not even sort of a Romeo and Juliet situation. It's really 2 households making this arrangement between them. We don't know why her marriages ended. It's very possible that her husbands died because of war, because of injury, because of illness. It's also possible that she was divorced 1 or more times. And that is not necessarily because she did something wrong. In fact, if she had done something wrong, it's less likely that she would have gotten remarried so many times, because she would have been seen as a dangerous alliance to make. So she could have gotten divorced because either her family or her husband's family wanted to make a better alliance with someone else, or perhaps there were other reasons at play we just don't know about. And even living with a man to whom she's not married, that was not necessarily immoral either in the first century, because actually there were really strict laws regulating who could get married. So enslaved people were not given the legal right to marry. Roman soldiers were not given the legal right to marry. Roman citizens could not marry a non-citizen. Jewish and Samaritan priests could only marry women from priestly families. So that really limits who you can marry with that legal right. And so possibly the woman had made an alliance with someone to whom she could not legally marry, but was nonetheless really useful and important for her family. Yeah. So she's had a tragic life, I would say, just based on the number of marriages that she's had. We're seeing a woman who has persisted through lots of difficulties in her life. But she's persisted, and she's not being shamed for her action.
Okay. Wow. That's incredible. There's a lot right there, and my mind is like going in like 100 different directions. But one of them would be, she is not an American woman. for sure.
No,
Right?
no, she's definitely not.
Wow. So, I mean, the difference between a Samaritan woman 2,000 years ago to an American woman 2,000 years later is abysmal.
Yeah.
And that's incredible. And that's even why I was kind of like playing upon the title of Samaritan Woman, Stay Away From Me.
Yeah, right.
I think, the Lenny Kravitz song, if anybody remembers that. I'm aging myself too, right here. But, okay, so how is that? Let's try to move from there to the MeToo before we go to Churchtoo. So how is that relate? Or tell us, let's just start right there. What is the MeToo movement? And then we'll move on to how is that related to this story?
Yeah. So the MeToo movement, it's was originally proposed by an activist named Tarana Burke a long time ago, but it really took off in the fall of 2017 as actresses, and then it filtered out to waitresses, hotel workers, politicians, and just across the country, across the globe, actually, women were using the MeToo hashtag to report their experiences of harassment and assault and rape that had gone ignored for way too long. I would say maybe we could just move on to Churchtoo now, if that's okay as well, and get it all.
Sure.
Yeah. So the Churchtoo movement, it didn't take too long when the MeToo movement really took off, that women in the church started reporting their own stories of harassment and assault, of sexual grooming by respected pastors, by youth leaders. And so that those women and some men as well started using the hashtag Churchtoo to share their own stories. And it's been heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking and devastating to read these stories, to recognize the way that spiritual authority in the church has not always been used well, that sometimes it has been used in ways that hurt and abuse vulnerable people in our churches.
Okay. So that's what MeToo and Churchtoo, where they kind of come together after this activists started. People started coming out with their own hurtful stories of abuse. Can you tell us maybe like one or two stories that grappled your attention the most, and maybe why those are important to you? I mean, of course, on the MeToo and Churchtoo movement, but or one or two stories. Just tell me, hit me with the truth.
Yeah. So if you search Twitter or other social media sites for the hashtag Churchtoo, you come up with so many stories, so many women sharing their experiences. A couple that have lingered with me. One woman who was in seminary. So she was training to be a pastor. She was doing an internship at a church. And an older male pastor used to come up behind her and just put his hands on her, touch her hair, and make comments. And I think, okay, that didn't progress beyond sort of that initial contact, but it could have. And that expresses an experience that I think a lot of women have probably had in the church, of people touching them in uncomfortable ways, of men touching them in uncomfortable ways. So the reports on the Churchtoo experiences run from the prosaic like that to the really horrifying accounts of women who, one woman in particular, had a close relationship with her youth pastor, and her youth pastor would have, intensive conversations with her. And one night driving her home, he stopped the car and assaulted her. And that left her, not knowing what to do, how do you deal with that experience when you're in youth group, when you're a teenager and your youth pastor assaults you? She reported it to the lead pastor at her church. who then accused her of misleading the youth pastor. That nothing happened to the youth pastor in that immediate situation. He was not even reprimanded. There's a tendency in when allegations of assault are brought forward in the church, there's definitely a long tendency of victim blaming. And women are made to feel ashamed for their own bodies, for the way they dress, even if it's a very conservative dressing style. They've done something wrong that has tempted a man to sin. And so it's their fault, not the pastor's fault or the youth leader's fault or the friend's fault. So those experiences, they just resonate across the board. There are so many different stories like this. Certainly from a lot of American churches, but also churches beyond the United States. So this is not just a North American problem.
Wow. Yes, that's right. And so I'm going to tell you, I mean, those are horrifying stories. And for sure, I mean, let's listen. You know, even my wife, you know, I'm gonna say something super personal, but even my wife, when this was going on, you know, she hashtag MeToo. And I was like, what the heck? Right. And I mean, but I guess to me, it was like, wow, we gotta listen and we gotta believe. Right. Yes. So that's one call. But so the other one is, I'm going to tell you a story from my own country. I'm from Mexico. I grew up in Guadalajara. So it's the second largest city in Mexico with 15 million inhabitants. It's massive. It's a beautiful city. But nonetheless, Mexicans, we're super used to hugging people, to kissing people. So for example, when I would meet anyone in Mexico, even, you know, a woman, I mean, mostly a woman, right? Argentinians are a little different because they kiss men kiss men to say hi. I have a lot of friends like that. And, you know, when I meet them, they're like, come here, Che, come here. I'm like, no. Oh, come on, just do it. And also I'm like, okay, whatever. So they abused me. Nah, I'm kidding. No, but in all honesty, in Mexico, sometimes we're so used to doing this, right? Like hugging and kissing and whatnot. So to me, it's like where is the fine line, the division line between, okay, that's a friendly hug, that's a friendly kiss, to women start to feel uncomfortable. Of course, it has to do with men's motives, I would assume. But I mean, where would you draw the line where this comes up? Where would you say, okay, I wanted to talk about the Billy Graham rule. So would you even say, okay, let's just not touch women at all. Let's just not kiss women at all. Let's just not be in the same car with a woman at all. I mean, where would you draw the line, Carin?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that it is so important to recognize different cultural expectations and how those operate. I lived for several years in Jerusalem, and there, again, the Palestinian culture is very touchy-feely. And so I got very used to lots of kissing, lots of hugging. And that never felt like harassment to me, certainly. And I would say in my church now, if one of my fellow worshipers came up and hugged me, that would not feel like assault or harassment to me. I think where it crosses the line is where, first of all, if it's someone you don't know, just someone who you don't have a personal relationship with, then that's problematic. I think if the hugging goes on for too long, or if hands wander to parts of the body where you wouldn't normally be touching during a hug, I think that's problematic. And I think as well, you're right that there's an issue of motivation and what is the reason for this? Is it to express friendship, fellowship, or are other things happening? Does it go along with comments that are being made about a woman's body or appearance? Does it go along with other comments that might not really fit with the context of a worshiping community? So I think it is tricky. And I definitely do not want to say that we should stop hugging or stop touching or stop kissing each other if that's our cultural context. I think the Billy Graham rule has done a lot of harm to women in the church, actually, because it means that women don't get mentored and encouraged to explore leadership options because they don't have men taking on that responsibility. And I think that there's also an issue there of, I would say with the Billy Graham rule, it picks up on some of that victim blaming that a woman is going to tempt a man to sexual sin, even if they're just having dinner together or talking together in an office. Maybe we need to reverse that and say, what is the man doing to control his own interests, his own thoughts? Because that's exactly what the New Testament says, right? It's not the stumbling block is the woman who causes you to sin. You are the stumbling block if you are looking at someone else with lust rather than with a true interest and love for them.
Yeah, wow, yeah, that's true. That's what the New Testament says. And I think, yeah, that's exactly what I think Jesus was referring to when he said, you know, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it out or pluck out your eye, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, well, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, it's not get rid of the woman, but get rid of your own body part. Yeah.
Okay. So when it comes to let's stay on the Billy Graham rule for a little bit. So that strikes me. It's interesting because I feel I'm married, right? So I have a wife. We've been married for like 14 years, I think.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Because we never celebrate our anniversary. We should start doing that soon. But anyways, I guess to me, I feel like it would come down, to our personal agreement as husband and wife. Like if we had a ministry in which she would feel more comfortable by me saying, hey, you know what? I'm never going to be with a woman alone, not even in a car, not even anywhere. But if that's our agreement with my wife, I feel like, okay, that sounds fair to me, right? But so do you think it comes down to like the particularities of everyone's case, or do you think there could be something along the lines of the Billy Graham rule that could be helpful as an outline for everybody to say, hey, let's do this, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I certainly think that it's good to have clear expectations for a marriage or for the way a church operates as well, right? So having meetings in public spaces rather than in private spaces, that could be a good ground rule to say that you won't have. And I don't even think it necessarily has to be between male and female, because we know that men are also abused in church contexts. So could we say we'll have our pastor's office has glass windows on the door so that you're never completely private with someone else? Is it possible that you can meet in spaces where you can still have a private conversation, but be in public view and realize that that others are keeping an eye out, and we're all keeping an eye out on each other to make sure that no one is put in a vulnerable position.
Yeah. Okay. So that's so good. So I'm going to tell you a story out of my own experience in this church. So I agree with what you were saying. It not only happens in America, it has happened in everywhere, right? I guess we're just humans and it happens. So I'll tell you the story, and then I want to move on to a more personal story. But this story is one of the churches I grew up in Mexico. That happened, one of the leaders, pastors of the church ended up committing some sort of abuse towards a little girl. And I mean, that's just horrendous. And for sure, I don't even know what to say to those persons who were the victims of this abuse, right?
Yeah.
Now, what I do know is that a lot of times it ends up in such a hurt that they end up like falling away or moving away from the faith altogether, right? And saying, I don't want anything to do with church, even being against the church, even, some of them have become feminist and say, I want to stand up for my own right as a woman. I don't, almost like to the point of like, I don't care about men anymore. So how do you feel about that reactive element of women almost like swinging on the pendulum all the way to the opposite? I mean, rightfully so, but how does that make you feel? Especially as a person that you're kind of like into theology and faith and the Bible too. So,
yeah, I completely understand why someone would make that decision. I think there's your basic trust in the church has been broken, and that can mean your trust in God has been broken too. Why has God not protected the victim in this case? I think that it's a natural reaction to have, to want to leave that community, to not be part of anything like that again. It also, as a New Testament scholar, as someone who is committed to the church, really hurts me to know that that's the reaction that so many women have. As much as I understand it, and as much as I want to say to any woman or man who has been victimized in these ways, do what you need to do for your own healing. It's a long process to heal from sexual trauma. But I also want to say we need to do better as the church to make the church a safe space in the first place, but also to address the ways that we have failed as the body of Christ, and to do better in our structures, do better in counseling, do better in having reporting structures so that when people do feel that they've been victimized in particular ways, they can report that and it can be heard and understood. That's just been too often that church communities have ignored allegations or rejected allegations in order to protect the institution rather than the individual. And we need to do better. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. I feel like that is it's like the hard part, that people want to almost like cover it for the sake of, you just said it right, for the sake of the institution. So that is shameful. That is horrendous to think about. And so, okay, I want to bring this to almost like a more personal level and see if it can be helpful for people listening. So when I think of just the relationship, you're into gender studies. So the relationship between a man and a woman as species, as humans throughout the eras is like, I don't know if you ever heard of this woman named Dr. Laura, but she was almost like a famous radio host, and she would take in calls from listeners, and they would have any question about their relationship and with their spouse or things like that, right? And a lot of her responses tended to be along the lines of, when it came to sex, right? It was usually, hey, men want to have a lot of sex, women just not so much, maybe once a year or something like that. And then she would say, she would kind of help him out, okay, what's the situation? Give me the scenario. And then almost like, this is what you got to do, right? And she was, massive, on the radio. Well, listen to. So when it comes to those maybe assumptions about sexuality, I feel like one is, I personally feel like we have the wrong assumption. First, that sex is sin or sex is bad. Some of us, a lot of us, I would say, and especially maybe within the church, even though luckily I feel like in my church in Mexico was super helpful in like, we got to tackle this. Like we want to teach you about sex here in church rather than from you to learn it from somebody in the street, right? So it was super helpful, at least, that they were open about that, and this is kind of like in my teens and early 20s. So super helpful. But at the same time, like this assumption of like the expectations that you were mentioning on sex, so when it comes to almost that desire, if it's true that men typically want to have sex all the time and women not so much because our wiring is different. And that's where I feel like that any psychologist or sociologist could agree. Like, yes, women and men are wired differently for the most part. I'm sure there can be other case scenarios that are minimal, but for the most part, I think it's safe to say, yes, that is the case. So with that as our base, what would be helpful to help us in those? How can you help us, as Dr. Lorda did, to say how to help the relationship between men and women when it comes to sex? Like, what is helpful to talk about? Do you have any ideas, suggestions? I don't know if it gets too personal, but
I don't know if I can. I'm just a New Testament scholar, so I don't know if I have any great insight to offer. I think one issue that I come back to over and over when I'm talking to students or to others about these questions, we get really obsessed with sex in the church. And certainly from the 2nd century to the 21st century, the church has had a real discomfort with sex. And particularly in the early church, sex was just seen as a problem, that something, sexual intercourse, even in a marriage, was spiritually problematic in that it weakened your Christian discipline. And so you should try and avoid it as much as possible, try to control your sexual impulses. I think that you're right, that's totally changing in the modern church. So now we tend to see sex celebrated more in terms of marital love and relationship. And I think that's a really healthy shift in the way the church has responded to sexuality. At the same time, I think that we sometimes miss some of the important messages in the New Testament about sex. And I particularly come back pretty often to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 and 7 as well. Paul sometimes has a reputation as someone who is anti-sex. I don't think that's true. I think he actually celebrates sex between married couples in 1 Corinthians 7. But he is against using someone else for your own pleasure. And I think that's a message that we can really push in the church, that you should not be taking advantage of someone else by the way you look at them, by the way you touch them, or by having sex with them. Don't take advantage of them for your own pleasure. Make sure that in a relationship, both people are being taken care of, and the needs on both sides are being taken into account so that no one feels that they're being taken advantage of. I think that requires a lot of honesty and openness, and that can sometimes be really uncomfortable. I'd say this is a way that, as well, for women in the church, at least in the churches that I've been part of, it's often been the case that because women are told over and over that they are a temptation to their brothers, that they are, to their Christian brothers, that they are leading men into sin by the way they dress or the way they look or the way they speak. Women tend to be given the responsibility because of this idea that men are sexual creatures and they can't control themselves. So it's the responsibility of women to keep control and to not let a relationship go where it shouldn't go. But I think that creates a lot of anxiety for women around sex. And so sometimes it might just take a little extra work to talk through these issues in a relationship and to reach agreements about comfort and what is good. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess let's just summarize. Is sex good?
The Bible says sex in marriage is very good. Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's move on from that to your own story. So as it relates to the Samaritan Woman story, even as I was holding the book right here in my hands for people to see, why is this such an important topic to you? For sure, you're into gender studies, but can you tell us a little bit about your personal story when it comes to just your relationship with MeToo or Churchtoo or the Samaritan Woman story?
Yeah. So I will say, first of all, that I have loved the Samaritan woman's story in John for such a long time. But I've also hated it a little bit because of the way that it's so often taught in the church, to the denigration of the woman. The story's turned into this message that we can be saved from our sexual sin. That's what the story is all about. And I don't think that that's what the story is about at all. And when we focus on sin and sex in the Samaritan woman's life, then we miss the fact that she is a model disciple and a leader in her community, someone who teaches about Jesus in her community. So she's a real model for women's leadership in Christian communities, not just for women, but for men as well, right? She's a model disciple in John. And therefore, she's important for men and women in the church to learn from in terms of her model. So I wanted to write about the Samaritan woman's story because I love her so much. And I think that she has a lot to offer to the church and a way to help us see just the diversity and the equality that existed in Jesus' ministry, and how we might think about ways that we have failed to maintain that diversity and equality through the history of the church. When the MeToo and Churchtoo movements really took off, I realized that it was an issue that I hadn't been addressing in my classes necessarily. This idea of sexual assault in the church. How do we see reflections of that in the New Testament? How could we learn from what Jesus says or Paul teaches to direct our own relationships today? And so I started incorporating different elements of the Churchtoo movement in particular into my classes. And my women students started telling me their stories of assault and harassment and rape in the church. And I realized that it's not just an issue for social media, it's an issue for my own community, and something that I really wanted to be able to speak into. And I think as a New Testament scholar, I've been lucky in my churches. I've experienced some of the harassment and unwanted comments that I think most women probably have experienced in their lives, but I don't have my own Churchtoo story. But I want to speak on behalf of others who do have these stories. And I wanted to speak to the church to call our attention to a way I think we have misread scripture, not just the Samaritan woman story, but a lot of stories about women get sexualized. So Mary Magdalene is represented as a prostitute who is repentant. The woman who anoints Jesus' feet and wipes them with her hair in Luke 7, she's often represented as a prostitute. She's not a prostitute in the text. She's called a sinner, but prostitution is not the only way that a woman can sin, right? So why do we assume that she must be a prostitute? So I think we have a problem with biblical interpretation here, that we sexualize the women in the Bible, and that teaches people in our churches that it's okay to sexualize women, that women's stories are only important when they revolve around issues of sex and usually sexual sin. And that spills over into how we treat women in our churches. And I think the Churchtoo movement is one of the devastating results of that.
Wow. I think so. Okay. So thank you for sharing and being so vulnerable on where the story of this book comes from. And thank you for voicing out these stories, and for even, I think to me, the key word here is listening. So let's talk about why you love the Samaritan woman. And I think when I read the story, one of my favorite elements of it is the whole interaction with, are we supposed to worship God here or in Jerusalem or in, and then Jesus answers, the true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think worshiping God in spirit and in truth means, especially in the scenario of the Samaritan woman and Churchtoo and MeToo?
Hmm. I think in that moment, so of course the Jews worshiped God in the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans, because they were not allowed to worship in the temple in Jerusalem, they worshiped on their own temple on Mount Gerizim, which happened to be overlooking the well where they're sitting at having this conversation. So it's right there. Um, and the idea there is, who are the true people of God? Is it you who worship in Jerusalem, or is it us who worship here on Mount Gerizim for the Samaritan woman? And Jesus' answer, the true worshipers worship in spirit and truth. He's setting up a new identity for the people of God entirely. It's not Jewish, it's not Samaritan, it's something new. And in spirit and truth, of course, the Holy Spirit is important there. Jesus is the truth in John's gospel. We also have this idea, of course, in John's gospel, Jesus is God in human form. And so when you're in the presence of Jesus, you are in the presence of God in truth. And so I think Jesus' comment there, he's saying, you don't have to go somewhere to worship, because when you're in my presence, you are in the presence of God and you can worship, which is a revolutionary thing at the time. I think for us today, we think, of course you can worship God wherever you are. But in the first century, that really, there were more limited spaces for where worship could happen in particular ways. And so this was a really revolutionary statement. And the woman's marital history doesn't matter in that situation. She is receiving this revelation because she has recognized who Jesus is, and she has pursued him and pursued this revelation through their conversation. I think Jesus giving her this grand statement of this new identity for who the people of God are, the fact that she's a woman is important there, not because she's some sort of terrible sexual sinner who needs to be forgiven, but because she's a Samaritan and a woman, and so has sort of this double check mark against her, that she doesn't have the status of someone who, of a Jewish man, for instance, someone who perhaps would be expected to be better educated, expected to understand what Jesus is saying. But it's the woman who recognizes what Jesus is saying, and she happens to be a Samaritan. And then she tells her entire village, there's a new way to be the people of God. It's the Jesus way of being the people of God. It's a really revolutionary message in that first century context, I think.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I agree. I love that, because my next and almost final question before going from blasphemous to divine is, I love how you said she ended up like being a leader for Jesus. She went and told the entire village about this man, right? So that in itself is like, wow, that's leadership, and that's a woman, and Jesus is affirming her. So that's amazing. So I wanted to pair this a little bit to the story of Job in the Old Testament. Okay, so here is how I kind of like portrayed it together. Job has like the worst life somebody can experience. Everybody dies in his family. And then Job gets to, in a sense, like complain or at least announce his pain and hurt to God, right? And what I'm amazed by is that God listens through and through. Like he listens to Job's complaint and lament and pain. But then God speaks too. And it's a massive, it's like the last however many chapters in the book of Job is like God speaking back at Job. So as I'm trying to pair these two scenarios, what would you say would be the response of God? What do you think? Like if God was listening to the cries of these women, what do you think would be God's answer back at them?
I think God hears those cries just as God heard Job's cries. I think sometimes we don't just like Job, we don't understand what is happening to us and why it's happening to us, but God is there with us through that darkness. I mean, in this story of the Samaritan woman, while I do not think that Jesus is accusing the woman of sexual sin, he does recognize the hardness of her life, that she has had this devastating history of multiple marriages, that she has, whatever has happened to end those marriages, it's not easy. She's had a very hard life, and Jesus recognizes that, and also recognizes who she is beyond the pain of that history, right? He recognizes that she's a woman who can understand him, that she's a woman who will persist through this conversation, and that she will be an evangelist on his behalf. So in that story, I think we see a model of how God sees the heart. God cares for women who are hurting, for men who are hurting, and God can use us even despite some of the terrible things that we experience in life.
Wow. All right. So this is the time when you get to tell me with my emojis. I'll show them to you again on my virtual background. So you're going to get to tell me, we're going to go from blasphemous to divine. Okay? So when it comes to the MeToo and the Churchtoo movement, what is the most blasphemous idea you can think of?
A quote from Ruth Everhart's book, The MeToo. I'm forgetting the title of her book. But Ruth Everhart, pastor, writes about the MeToo movement in the church. She writes about a young woman who was raped during a Christmas Eve service in her church building, in the hallway of her church. And she ends that story by saying, I wonder if the stranger who raped this woman had been taught to read scripture in a way that made women rapeable. And I think that question just devastates me. It has lingered with me. And I can't imagine anything more blasphemous than teaching people to read scripture in a way that makes women rapeable and leads to a situation where women are raped.
Wow. I agree. Okay. So what is the most skeptical idea you can think of, or what are you skeptical of when it comes to the MeToo Churchtoo movement?
Skeptical, but also hopeful about whether we can weather the storm, right? Can we really be honest with ourselves about what we've done? And can we take on the immense work of making the church a better place, a more holy place, a safer space for all people to thrive in the faith?
Love it. Okay, so moving on to inspire emoji. What inspires you when it comes to the MeToo church or Churchtoo movement?
I think it inspires me to hear people sharing their stories. They are so courageous and so brave, the men and the women who have shared their stories of different experiences they've had in Christian communities and have pursued that even though they have been silenced or even though they have been ignored. They have not remained silent. They have refused to remain silent. And that really inspires me, that courage.
Love it. Okay, so next one would be holy. So where do you see holy or holiness in this movement?
I think that we are trying to do better. I think pastors like Ruth Everhart writing on the MeToo movement and talking to the church and calling the church to account. There are so many publications like that have come out. I think there is a real attempt that's being made to listen to the people who are bringing these allegations and to shape a more faithful church that will protect people.
Love it. Okay, so finally, divine emoji. What is the most divine idea when it comes to even women in general?
Jesus recognized women, and Jesus authorized women to speak about him to others. His when he's talking to the disciples, when the Samaritan woman has left him and he's talking to the disciples, and they're asking him, why are you talking to a woman? What the heck is going on here? Well, we've been off buying food. And Jesus answers with this sort of parable about the fields are ripe for the harvest. Other people have planted the seeds. Other people have tended the fields, and now the harvest is ready. The Samaritan woman is the one who's been doing that, right? She is leading the harvest back to Jesus as they speak, the harvest of her fellow villagers. Jesus recognizes women's voice. Jesus recognizes women and their significance to the kingdom of God. And I think that's divine.
Love it. Okay. So finally is where can you point people to find more about your work, your writings, even your book?
Yeah, so my book is available at intervarsitypress.com. You can find out more about me at the Westmont College Religious Studies webpage. I have my own webpage there with a list of other things that I've written and done.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the show. See you on the next one. So, my friends, thank you for watching Christian Podcast Live. 3 ways in which you can support the show. Number 1, subscribe to our channel on Roku TV, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you might be listening or watching, and leave a positive review or write a comment. All right, that's 1. Number 2, visit ChristianPodcast.com and check out our emoji merch. Amazing emojis at ChristianPodcast.com. And finally, if you want to participate in the book giveaway, follow us on Instagram right now at XTian Podcast, XTian. Because I'm Mexican, so I said Mexican. Okay. XTian Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to see you there. See you guys on the next one.
Mire, tean himan.
La speranza è il futuro.